Hello you guys, this is Josh here from Infinity Productions MTG, here to show you my first deck tech for Standard. This right here is a black-white mid-range deck that I've been having success with lately for the past few weeks. Made a couple top 8s recently, actually just last week. The time of this recording is April 14th, 2014. I'll also leave you a deck list right below somewhere in the link to show you the full list of this deck. But anyways, I'm going to pretty much explain the mana base, the creatures, and the spells in this deck, why I think this is the better route to go with this deck, and why I don't think Pack Rat is not really good for this type of deck, even though some black-white mid-range decks prefer it. I personally don't, because I don't think Pack Rat is really good for this format, in my own opinion, because lately I've kind of come to realize that Pack Rat, while it can kind of give you some free wins with certain decks, with most decks that are pretty dominant, like now, like Esper Control, we just don't want to be sacrificing a lot of cards to add a lot of Pack Rats, or be in Detention Spirit and be able to lose a lot of control after that. But anyways, let's get to the deck. We got the mana base right here with 26 lands, pretty much 4 Godless Shrines, 4 Temple of Silence, 3 Orzhov Guild Gates, pretty much to make our mana base curve out a little bit, because we are splashing a couple of white cards in this deck. So it's very important that we have as much white mana on top of black mana as well too, so we'll be able to have options. 3 planes to also again add some mana so make the mana curve a little bit better. Again, to cast things like Obstinate, where they cost 2 white, and things like Elspeth, where it also costs 2 white as well. 9 swamps, because for the most part this is a mono black deck. With just a splash of white, but our black is going to be our main color, our primary color for this deck. And then last but not least, 3 Mutavaults. Even though we aren't playing Pack Rats, this is a 2/2 beatdown creature that does lots of things. Dodges sorcery removal things like Mizium Mortars and Supreme Verdict. Whenever the field is clear, whenever they're tapped out, it's always a great beater of a card. So even though we're not playing Pack Rat, it's still a great card. And then going down to our creature list here, starting from Obstinate right here. Whoops. We're running 3 Obstinates and 3 Blood Barons, and I went this route mainly because for a while I thought Obstinates didn't seem all that great, so I was running things like 4 Blood Barons. Then I started running into a lot of Esper Control, which Esper Control has a little bit of a harder matchup against Obstinate versus Blood Baron, because they can Supreme Verdict away a Blood Baron, but they can't Supreme Verdict a Obstinate unless they're playing things like Fated Retribution or Quicken with a comboed Supreme Verdict, which Quicken can allow to cast things like Supreme Verdict at instant speed. But Obstinate, I think, in my opinion, in this deck is probably the best creature, because it drains them life, it's a beater, it exiles, and you get to do the same thing over and over and over. So, and you're gaining life out of it too, and with certain cards like Underworld Connections, where you're losing life, you want to be able to gain some life, so that way you're getting more card advantage and getting answers to your cards, and not losing a lot of life to where you're down to 1 life and you can't do anything at all. So, great card, best card in the deck. And then going to Lifebane Zombies, which I'm running a playset of 4. I think, in my opinion, this is the reason why I'm not running Pack Rat, because honestly, I like the Lifebane Zombie for the hand disruption, being able to look at your opponent's hand, and if they are playing things like white creatures or green creatures, especially if I'm playing against mirror matches, the Lifebane Zombies in this deck make it a lot easier for me, because if they're playing things like Blood Baron or Obstinate, it's just easier for me to know that I can get rid of a card like that, and it doesn't allow me to waste things like Devour Flesh or Here's Downfall just to kill that kind of creature. So an early threat to most aggro decks, mid-range decks, control decks. It also is able to get bypassed planeswalkers, things like Elspeth and Jace, where not a lot of my creatures can really do that. It's a great beater of a card. 3/1 at worst. Intimidate, and can at least look at your opponent's hand for some kind of information. So I love this card. I don't think I'm going to be taking this card out anytime soon. Also because I've been running into a lot of green red monsters for a while. This card became very important to me. So being able to take care of against red-green monsters is important, because having this in the main board really does help out in our matchup a lot. So if we can win game 1, game 2 can almost look just as promising when we get to the sideboarding as well, which I'll also get to later after showing the main deck. So Desiccation Demon comes next. We're running a playset of those. Great against the small aggro decks where they can have a little bit of a hard time dealing with it. It's great against mono blue, I think, when they're not playing the Master of Waves, of course. But for 4 mana, 6/6, it's a beater. It beats your opponent's face for 6 damage. If they have no ways of answering to it, it can be kind of an annoying card at times. But this kind of tends to be our weakest card against certain matchups. If we're playing against the mirror match, I've taken them out against Esper. And the reasons why I'm taking Desiccation Demons out is they have too many answers to Desiccation Demon. Things like if I'm playing the mirror match, they can Hero's Downfall, Devour Flesh, Ultimate Price. Esper Control can do kind of those same things with D-Sphere, Supreme Verdict. So you're kind of throwing out a card out there and not really doing anything with the card. So I'm kind of taking those out for better cards, which, like I said, I'll get to the sideboard and hopefully be able to explain that earlier on. But Desiccation Demon, it is a strong card, but with certain matchups I kind of take them out. But I still think it's a good card to keep in this main board, though, however. So, and then going to probably one of my favorite creatures in the deck. I would probably say my second or third favorite card. I haven't really decided. Blood Baron. Again, I was running 4 for a while with this deck, and then I kind of curved it down to 3, so made it balance more with the 3 and 3 curve with the opposite on Blood Baron. And Blood Baron in this meta is really good. It is still pretty good against Esper, despite them having Supreme Verdict. They are not able to D-Sphere it or Azorius Charm it, but they can kill it with things like Elspeth. That can just kill the Blood Baron. But other than that, the lifelink is also important too. So while we're damaging my opponent's face, you're getting life out of it, and it definitely puts them on a turn clock when you're playing against other aggro matchups. So great card to have in this deck. I don't think I can really hate this card ever, unless they make more hate for Blood Baron or more answers to Blood Baron. But yeah. So going to Elspeth, are pretty much our only Planeswalker in the deck. Mixed dudes as well. Can also be a great board wipe when we're playing against mirror matches when they're playing Blood Barons as well. So this card is a card I never really sideboard out unless if I'm playing against Boros Burn or very, very, very quick aggro decks that could probably win on turn 4 at best, or threaten to kill you on turn 4 or 5. Elspeth is one of the best cards in this deck and can help you out. Can be a great late game card no matter what. So when you need her, she's there. So that's Elspeth for you. So going down with the list, on the bottom is our spells. Starting on the left is Revoke Assistance, and while that may seem like it's a weird card for this deck, Revoke Assistance actually targets a lot of things in this format right now. As far as like the Cruiser, the 2/4 Centaur that gains you gains them a life when they play a land. When you're playing against mono blue, they're playing things like Thassa and Bind Thassa, which are both enchantments, and those can be great targets to deal with as well. In the mirror match or Esper Control, they'll play things like Detention Sphere or Underworld Connections. So if you can have answers to that, awesome. And it also keeps you up with the game. In the race, when you're playing against the mirror match, they have their own Underworld Connections, but you can slow them down by playing things like Revoke Assistance, so then that way they're not catching up, and you can at least be able to stabilize. So, going right next to it, Ultimate Price is another card that I've kind of rotated in between with things like Doomblade, because for a while I had Doomblade in the main board for a while because of all the green-red aggro that was going around. That seemed to be the best deck in Standard for a while, but Standard goes, it's always a rotating format where certain decks can be some of the best. Then suddenly it became mono black, and mono black was pretty much almost everywhere. It probably still is. It's still a good deck. So I kind of gravitated towards more playing Ultimate Price, because if we can have an answer to Packrad on turn 2 if they play it, a great target to a card like that, because you don't want them to overboard the field with Packrads. So if you can answer to it really quickly with an Ultimate Price, awesome. It also kills a Desecration Demon in the mono black matchups. As far as the green-red aggro decks or monster decks, kills things like a Plochronos and a Storm Breath Dragon, a Centaur, and probably many other monocolored creatures I'm probably spacing out on. Bramaz is another card too. So I like Ultimate Price a lot better than Doomblade. I don't know. I'd be kind of curious to know what your choice of removal would be. What are your main removals? Because I'm running pretty much 10 removals in this deck. As far as the other spells, Hero's Downfall, 4 of, pretty simple, kills about 90% of the creatures in this format right now, as well as being able to target Planeswalkers. Such a great, important card. So you're never really taking out that card when you're playing against things like Esper Control, because if you can kill things like Elspeth and Jace, that's great. Dominate Rod as well. So it has a lot of targets in this meta right now. It's the best removal in Standard right now, so I gotta love Hero's Downfall for that reason. Thoughtseize, playing a playset of this, the best turn 1 you can do with this deck. When you're being able to gain information and hand disruption, being able to take a card, their best card, and being able to follow it up with other linking cards, that can pretty much get you. Best card I think in Standard, obviously. I think it's pretty obvious for most people. A lot of people would probably think it's also overrated as well. But there's Thoughtseize for you. Awesome card. 2 Devour Flashes come next, and we use this to make our mirror matches a lot better when they're playing things like Blood Baron, because Blood Baron against our deck is also very bad. So if you can if you can have an answer to things like Blood Baron, you want to be able to run things like Devour Flash. I did run 3 for a while, and then kind of broke it down to just running 2, because there were times that them gaining some life would be kind of important for them, but I would be kind of a turn or two so late for them gain life. But it's not a bad card. It's another great answer to an early Packrad if needed be, or if you just need to Devour Flesh your own Desecration Demon when you're playing against things like Boros Burn in ways. But will kill pretty much any creature in the format, any lone creature on the field by itself, and another great answer to things like Blood Baron. And then right next to it, 3 Underworld Connections. This is a great card to have. You never run out of fuel with the deck, but when you're playing against things like Esper, where they're always playing things like Syncs of Relations, and you can kind of keep up with the race with Underworld Connections, and being able to draw these cards at instant speed is also very important too. And when you have things like life gain in this deck, like Opposite and Blood Baron, it always refuels your hand, and again keeps you in the race against things like Esper Control. So, important card to have overall. For the most part, you're taking them out for against very heavy aggro decks, because aggro decks pretty much beat you down very easily, and they're trying to threaten you by turn 3 or 4. So, in a way, you just want to pack in more removal. Then to our last card is Bile-Blight. Bile-Blight is an amazing card when you want to have a perfect answer to things like Pack-Rat. Also kills things like Elspeth tokens, and when need to be, Mutavaults as well, because Mutavaults can also be a pain in the butt card when you have really no answers to it. So, but for the most part, Bile-Blight's going to be in there for Pack-Rats, because as soon as they start going off of Pack-Rats, you want to be able to have a cheap, effective card that will actually be able to answer to that Pack-Rat. So, Bile-Blight's definitely in there for that main reason, because people still play Pack-Rat despite there being a Bile-Blight. But anyways, that's the main board. Let's go off to the sideboard. Alright, and here's the sideboard for the black-white mid-range. Starting on the top left corner is our playset of Duress. That is Urza's Saga, because I love old school cards, so why not? Gotta represent. Great card against Esper Control, also against other mid-range decks. Being able to take care of removal, planeswalkers, anything that's pretty much not a creature or a land. But it's the perfect card against Esper Control. So when you bring these in, you're pretty much adding in more hand disruption cards, which makes your matchup a lot easier. So, because when you can win game 1 against Esper Control, you have such a great advantage in the next game that the more card disruption that you can have in the early game with things like Duress and Thoughtseize against Esper Control, can pretty much almost win you the game from there. So another great card to have against them. Disrupts their hand deck. I don't know if I could ever really downgrade to 3, anything lower than 4, so it's a card that I think is meant to stay. And then the card right next to it, Revoke Assistance. We play 1 in the main board and 1 in the sideboard. This is another card that comes up against Esper Control, against things like D-Sphere, against Mono Blue when they have Thassa and Biden of Thassa. Great against Change of the Rocks, since black doesn't really have a good way of answering to enchantments, or not really at all. When you splash in the white, it makes your curve a lot better, to where you can actually be able to target things like artifacts and enchantments. Also, another great card to get rid of Pithing Needle when they name things like Elspeth. So, using Revoke Assistance definitely comes in when I'm playing against decks like that. Then right next to it, Sin Collector. This is another hate card against Esper. This sideboard pretty much contains a lot of hate for Esper Control, if you have noticed. Sin Collector is also another hand destruction card, which adds, again, more to that. In the end, when you're adding 4 Duresses and 2 Sin Collectors, you're pretty much having 13 ways of looking at your opponent's hand. That's also including Life Bane Zombie. Even though it can whiff, you're still looking at your opponent's hand and be able to get information out of your opponent. And that will make it a lot easier for you to get around things like counterspells, things like that. And speaking of counterspells, those tend to be instant spells. So Sin Collector is a great target for things like that, instant or sorcery. Sometimes you kind of get a 2-for-1 out of this, but sometimes they're going to want to kill the Sin Collector, which kind of leads you to taking out another card out of their hand. Also, another great card against Boros Burn, because they usually tend to kill this creature off as well as you trying to get rid of a card. Worst case scenario is a 2/1 that looks at your opponent's hand. And I definitely like it against Boros Burn because it's another card that can also block as well as attack when they're playing things like Ash Zealot. So when you need a blocker, that's also Sin Collector. So then going down is Fiendslayer Paladin, and going back to Boros Burn. Boros Burn in the very beginning before I had Fiendslayer Paladin was a very tough matchup, and usually on turn 5 I was pretty much losing the game when I would be slamming things like an Obsidot or a Bloodburn because they're winning the game just by skull cracking, you're not gaining life, and by turn 6 or turn 5, if you're at very low life, you're pretty much dead due to a lot of burn spells. So Fiendslayer is a great card against that that deck. It's an early threat, and they pretty much puts them on a race. They have to kind of have that Fire Satyr Dancer to deal with it, or Change of the Rocks to slow me down just a little bit. But it's great because it can't be targeted by red spells, and you're gaining life out of it, and it's first strike. You're also playing it against like very little heavy aggro decks that are a bunch of 2/2s. Great against mono red as well. It can just be a pain in the butt card to deal with, and it's an early threat. So after putting this into my sideboard, my matchups have been a lot better because of it. When you add things like Duress and Sin Collector to it, being able to have the hand disruption follow it up with a creature can really just be their worst nightmare ever. So Fiendslayer is awesome. Against mono black, I also have them against them, but in the mirror matches, I've learned that it's not so great against the mirror match. Even though it does get away with certain removal, it tends to be a weak creature against some of their bigger creatures. So I kind of tend to keep that in the sideboard against the mirror matches. So, but overall, a great card against aggro and Boros Burn especially. So looking for a great early threat against Boros Burn, and you're wanting to play a deck like this, I definitely suggest Fiendslayer Paladin because it can pretty much win you games, no other. Right next to it is the 3 Doomblades, and this was kind of going back to what I was saying about the ultimate price switcheroo round, rotation kind of thing. Doomblades are great against the red-green monster decks. Anything that's pretty much not playing black is just, it's such a great card. So when you're playing against aggro decks that are not black, or mostly not black, Doomblade's the card for you because you go from 10 removal spells to having 13 more, to 13 removal spells. So you're almost never you're almost never really losing the game if you're adding more cards like Doomblade. So, and it's able to target pretty much most of those creatures that's not black. So, great card in general. Yeah, nothing more to say about Doomblade, honestly. Just an amazing card. Perfect sideboard card when you're playing against aggro overall. And last but not least, another card that is obviously against Esper control, but for the most part, against the mirror match as well, is Erebos, God of the Dead. Makes your opponent where they can't gain life, so a Sing-Star Revelation doesn't allow them to gain life. However, they can still draw cards, but that's fine as long as they're not gain life. Whatever. It's also an enchantment creature. So, and there's ways of turning on this creature because you have ways of like Lifebane Zombie, Underworld Connections to turn it into a creature. But worst case scenario, he can be an enchantment creature that can also draw you cards by paying 2 life. In worst case scenarios, but Erebos was probably the last change that I made to this deck because, again, I was struggling against a lot of Esper control decks, and not having this card in my sideboard was pretty bad. So after learning my lesson from playing against Esper Control, I made the sideboard a lot better by adding Erebos, and it's been so much better. Yeah, and against the mirror matches, it is definitely important. So it was one of those cards that I was kind of like, why do I not have this card in this deck? So, in my sideboard. So that's Erebos. Erebos does everything that you want it to do. Pretty much draws you a card and can become a creature. Yada yada yada. So that's the deck for you. Sideboard as well. So if this is a deck that you're kind of interested in and you're wanting to play pretty much the exact list of this, like I said, I'll be able to have a link below somewhere in the description. So if you like the deck, feel free to play it at your local F&M. I definitely suggest playing this deck a lot because I consider it one of the best decks in Standard right now. That has a lot of good matchups against other decks. So I can't say, well, I think the only matchup it doesn't have the only tough matchup I think it has is probably Naya Hexproof, and I haven't really encountered that. But again, in this sideboard as well, there's ways of dealing with Naya Hexproof if needed be. So, but other than that, it's a great deck. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it below. And I apologize if I've kind of rambled on too much, as I'm probably doing right now. This is my first deck tech. I do plan to do more later on. And hopefully I'll try to be able to upload some more gameplay video sometime soon. To get to the point, like I said, this is my first deck tech, so let me know how I did, things I can kind of improve on. Maybe for my next future deck tech I can probably go a little bit faster. So, but hope you like this. And in short, if you want to play this deck, I definitely suggest you playing this. So that's about it. Thanks for tuning in, and see you guys soon.